I think I first began to reflect about war when I was a teenager. I began to read about war. I thought it was fun. And I studied Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the original Latin and read about Alexander the Great and Scipio Africanus and all of that. And then I got to be a Marine, and I thought the training was fun. And this is a theme that has interested me from different perspectives more recently until today, is how the establishments of different countries, including this one particularly, try to make, and with some success, make war seem to be fun to the young people who have to do the fighting, and then try to interest and get the support of the nation that backs them up to make the war possible. Now, I found myself in 1962 standing off the mouth of the Congo as a young Marine lieutenant, and we were briefed. We were on the flight deck of this aircraft carrier. We had our weapons out with ammunition in them to go in, and it suddenly occurred to me in the wee hours of the morning, kill Africans. And I remember thinking all of a sudden it wasn't, fantasizing killing gooks. We really would go in and kill Africans to accomplish whatever that mad little scheme was. I was greatly relieved that that mission was canceled. I also stood off the Dominican Republic, off of Cuba, off of Nicaragua while I was a Marine, but always saved from having to go in and kill. But then I got out of the Marine Corps into the CIA, and I saw bits of wars, different, not World War II big wars, but still the war in the Congo, the Vietnam War towards the end. There were certainly plenty of people being killed. The Angolan War, people being killed. And always I was struck by the young men and trying to figure it out, the young men that were sent in to do the killing and to be killed. I began to notice that they are generally not very enthusiastic about their role in these wars. Now, this is not true today, my observation. I think in Grenada those Marines were pretty enthusiastic, but it was kind of, they were told they were doing a necessary thing, and there's a lot of excitement at that level, and it wasn't buckling down and fighting. We're seeing some protests come from the Marines in Lebanon now who are being asked to sit there for a reason that I doubt if Reagan or anyone else could explain very clearly. There's no one for them to shoot back at, which would relieve their young man's reaction. Not that that, in my opinion, would solve anything, but we're beginning to see their reaction to war, the soldier's reaction when he really gets into it. I saw this in Vietnam, 1973 to 75, when we'd Vietnamized the fighting. These young Vietnamese, 18-year-olds, would be marched up to the foot of this mountain near the Tay Ninh post where I was, and they would be ordered to charge the communist forces up on the mountain. And they would take 3 steps forward and lie down and wouldn't proceed, because of course there they were flagrantly aware of the fact that the generals and colonels and majors and captains and lieutenants and the president of the country, and of course many of the Americans who were involved in the aid and military aid, they were all corrupt. They were all making fortunes out of the war. The only people who weren't benefiting from it were the young people who had to go and kill or be killed. Now, I reflected about this a lot, the way you do if you're stuck up country in a Tay Ninh, and then the scars that it'll leave later, trying to figure out war. Why do we have wars if the young people, when they get into them, don't find them to be so much fun? And I came to conclude that the greatest power, the most satisfying power there can be for power-happy people, such as presidents of the United States, is not to send planes to bomb Cambodia, say, although that's power, but that's a lesser power. The greatest satisfaction that a president of the United States can have, and one after the other has done it or dreamed of doing it, is to send our own young people off to die and tell them that it's noble and honorable and worthwhile. That is power, sending your own people off to die. This is what Reagan, of course, is just since before he came into office, dying for the opportunity to play the role of commander, sending the young people off to die. Now, they have a version of this, of course. The height of politics, I suggest to you, is when you bring the bodies back in the caskets and you lay them out with the flags. And the president goes out, Arlington Cemetery, and you have all of the television cameras in the world focusing on his face while he reads this speech that he's memorized, and you catch the tear in his eye, and the Drum and Bugle Corps from the Marine Corps about the noble sacrifice of this young man, of his life for his country. But of course we see we're more sophisticated than we were 100 years ago or before. We see that it isn't necessarily country, sometimes it's ego and whim of the people in power, exercising their power. Now, I noticed that, not being a historian, but reading the history of this country, we get into a war about every 10 years. Every one of these wars we have managed, we being our establishment, our presidents and politicians and business leaders, have managed to convince the people, or at least has tried very hard to convince them, that the enemy was very evil. At one time, you may or may not recall your reading of history, they sent General Maxwell Taylor down here across what was the recognized border into Mexico, and he paraded around until the Mexicans shot at him, and then we had a provocation and an incident, and then the headlines beat the drums until it was a noble thing to go and kill Mexicans in the Mexican War. As a result of that war, the United States stole New Mexico and California from the Mexican government. Now, in each of these wars, the Indian War, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Campaign, World War I, always beating the drums, convincing the people that the enemy is totally evil. Now we've got a new game we've been playing since World War II, which is that communists are evil. Anything that you can label as a communist is justified to make war against them. So we've had wars killing communists where they don't exist, by the way, in the Ituri forests of the Congo, in the wastelands of Angola, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and now we're invading Grenada because of Marxist radicals. Those Marxist radicals weren't killing anybody. There was a cabinet coup. They assassinated the leader and his cabinet. There was no threat to anyone, but it was justification because there was some Marxism involved to invade, which we've done. Now, very briefly, so that I won't go out on a negative note altogether, the purpose of what I wanted to say to you tonight was my reflections have not been totally in vain. I figured out how to stop wars. Now, mind you, I thought about this a lot. I thought about it for years, and I finally figured out how to stop wars. Now, what you have to do, see, the people in power, the people in the White House, for example, the president, even though he's sending American people off to die, he still is able to disassociate himself from the people who go and die. They're not real human beings to him like his own family. They're people from Austin, Texas, or San Antonio, or Pocatello, Idaho, or somewhere that they order to be drafted, and they suck into a glamorous military program, and they send them off to fight and die. Now, the way I figured it out, in order to stop wars, we have to personalize wars so that the man who signs the paper, the order of war, so that the first person to die, so it's in his own family, so it's real people who die. I thought about this a lot. It's a little barbaric, but then war is barbaric. People get killed and they die miserably, and those who don't die suffer the destabilizations and dislocations and the loss of their own loved ones. So I figured out the way we could stop war would be if we had a ceremony. And when the president signs the act of war, you would immediately you could construct a brick and concrete thing in the White House lawn and break out the Drum and Bugle Corps, and you take the president's closest male kin and you shoot him immediately. Now, see, obviously, I mean, I could visualize a president really agonizing, thinking about, if I sign this, you know, but then I thought about it. By the time I developed this theory, Jimmy Carter was in power, and his closest male kin, I believe, was Billy. And my theory had some other weaknesses in it, which was that after he's had one war to get rid of, you remember also Lyndon Johnson had Sam Houston Johnson, and I mean, you can see someone eager to win the election to solve a personal problem. And then after they've had one war or two wars or three wars and they've run out of close male kin, then what's to stop them from having wars all over the place after that, after they've paid their price? So I had to come up with a better theory, and I did. What we need to do in order to stop wars permanently is to redesign, to make a law so that when the president signs the act of war, you take that big mall in Washington, below the Capitol, in front of the White House, all the way down to the reflecting pool, and you put barbed wire around it and pup tents in it. And when they sign the act of war, you take the president, the White House staff, the Congress, the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, all of them, and you run them in there and you put dungarees on them, and they sleep on the ground in pup tents and they eat sea rations as long as the war goes on. Now, I don't think that you wouldn't have to kill a lot of them, but to make it realistic, just every hour or two, a few mortars, you know, and it's just, you know, just so that they realize how much fun this really is. And then just so that you won't have Ronald Reagan or Attila the Hague thinking this sort of stuff is fun, when you run them through this tent to take off their $700 suits and put on the dungarees, you have the doctors rub them down with the jungle rot, and you don't give them any medicine until the war is resolved. I swear, based on my profound knowledge of men in action and elsewhere, there would be no war or international confrontation that couldn't be resolved in about a day and a half time. There's still a few problems. We would have to do it in Moscow and London and Tel Aviv and Buenos Aires. My point, however, I hope is crystal clear. I am convinced, there is not the slightest doubt in my mind, that our noble president and our noble government in Washington will manipulate us into a war. They're doing everything they possibly can. The historical cycles are crystal clear. And as John Henry said a while ago, indirectly, but saying the same thing, the only thing that will stop us is ourselves. It's not Ronald Reagan's country. It's a little bit his and a little bit yours and a little bit mine. If we want to be part of a war, if we want to be ordered, if we're young, to go off and kill and be killed, if we're not quite so young, to have our loved ones sent off to kill and be killed, then we have to work, we have to organize, we have to speak, we have to make enough pressure felt right now in order to stop them from the course they've committed themselves to, or we will be at war in Central America most likely in the very near future. Thank you very much for hearing me out.